Hello everybody, we are in week 14 and we will be covering chapter 12, which is psychological disorders. Here is the to-do list for the week and your objectives. Now, one thing I want to point out as you're reading through chapter 12, you're going to be introduced to all the major categories of psychological illness, but the book will touch on ways to treat, but we'll get more in depth into treatment in chapter 13. So what I kind of want you thinking about as you're going through this is each time you encounter one of the disorders, be thinking about how we might view the disorder differently depending upon what perspective we take. So this is going to be going back to some of what we've covered in previous chapters where we've looked at the psychodynamic perspective when we talked about personality, behavioral perspective, anything that deals with evolutionary perspective, biological perspective, as well as social learning theory. All of these theories sort of have been contributors to what we now understand as ways of treating different disorders by just viewing the symptomology and the behaviors that go with it a little differently. We can zone in on how to best treat it. So I just want you thinking about that as you're going through and reading. You're going to be introduced to a brief history of mental illness and how psychology as a discipline has sort of attacked mental illness, like what has been our approach, how did we view it a century ago versus today, what strides have we made, and what models do we use to explain psychological disorders. You're going to be introduced to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, and it basically outlines all the psychological disorders, and it gives you different rates of prevalence, how prevalent is it in a certain population, who has it, males, females, as well as what diagnostic labels are given to it. And you'll take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of using those. And so that'll give you kind of like a good intro into mental illness. And then it starts breaking down mental illness by the various types. So we're going to look at one overarching category, which is anxiety disorders. One of the disorders that falls in that category is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and other stress-related disorders. We'll look at some potential causes of that. And then we'll dive into dissociative disorders, which has previously been known as multiple personality disorder. Look at some explanations as to that. And then we'll jump into another main category of disorder, which are mood disorders. Now, this includes major depressive disorder and bipolar disorders, as well as dysthymic disorder, and lesser degrees of depression. And we'll look specifically at some explanations for that. So here we get into some of the behavioral, social, cognitive, and biological explanations for mood disorders. We'll branch off into eating disorders and looking at some of the cultural factors surrounding that, as well as sexual dysfunction and disorders surrounding that. And then we'll move into schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a broad category. We'll take a look at what the symptomology is. There's positive and negative symptoms associated with this disorder, and primarily what the genetic and environmental influences are. What we know to date is sort of the nature-nurture side of schizophrenia. And then we will finish with looking at personality disorders and some subclasses and subtypes of personality disorders, as well as prevalence rates amongst those. And then lastly, just some methods to overcome test anxiety, which is super helpful for students. So here are your slides for chapter 12. The videos that you're going to be watching this week are kind of broken up a little differently than they have been in the past. You're going to be watching only the first 2 videos in episode 17. Episode 17 combines psychological disorders with therapy. So you'll watch the first 2 videos this week, and then next week when we cover therapy, you'll watch the other 3 videos. I've also posted a few additional videos, one on a certain type of OCD as well as another. These 2 individuals suffer with OCD, but the kind of OCD that they have is a little different. So what the obsessions are about vary. And so you can get a nice kind of conceptualization of people who have OCD, what that looks like. And they're both pretty short segments. And then I have a segment on disorganized schizophrenia. So schizophrenia breaks down into different subtypes, and disorganized is one of them. And you'll get a clip from the movie The Soloist here to see sort of what that looks like briefly. In your discussion for the week, you're going to be reading Hawk 31, which is Learning to be Depressed. And this is really looking at Seligman and Myers' idea that depression can be largely related to life circumstances, particularly the amount of control one has in their life. When things are uncontrollable in our life or seem out of control, and we feel like nothing we do matters or makes a difference, they would argue that this is where we can become depressed, and it can really weigh on our emotional well-being. So they studied depression, and they've studied its etiology, and this would sort of fall under that social learning theory of depression. So you're going to be taking a look at that, but I also want you integrating the main chapter from Ciccarelli and White. You're going to be integrating in chapter 12, where it talks about depression. What else do we know about depression from the chapter that can relate to Seligman and Myers' contribution that they made via their theories as it's presented in Hawk. And you're also going to be digging back into chapter 9, where we talked about health and stress. And I want you thinking about if you had a client suffering from depression, what would be some coping strategies that you could use to increase their sense of control over external events? So if we know that a portion of depression really can stem from controllability, that's something we can do something about. So we can enact various coping strategies that would allow us to try to have more control in certain circumstances, and thus maybe aid in the depression that we're feeling. So I want you looking back on that and integrating some of that here in your discussion. And then lastly, you just have a quiz on the chapter, and that will wrap up the week. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.